And now we're going to move on to why we're all here. Jane Kinsman works with couples, families, and individuals. Her particular areas of interest include couples intimacy and conflict, couples recovering from an affair, coping with stressful life transitions, depression, loss, trauma, and anger management, and a number of other issues. And she is trained in integrative systematic therapy and has extensive postgraduate training in dialectical behavior therapy, in addition to other third-wave behavioral therapies. And with that, Jane, I'm going to pass it off to you, and I'm going to mute my mic after you come in. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cassie. It's my pleasure. And thank you for that introduction. And welcome, everybody, to the webinar. I'm really looking forward to talking today about resolving conflict effectively. I thought I'd start out by saying just a little bit about myself and giving a little bit of an intro to the talk today. So as Cassie said, my name's Jane Kinsman. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I work a lot with couples, individuals, and families. I've been doing that for about 14 years. I also teach in our graduate program here at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. I've been doing that for about 11 years. I'm also a Northwestern alumni, just like the rest of you. So I graduated from the Marriage and Family Therapy program at the Family Institute back in 2005. So I'm really happy to be here, happy to talk to all of you. And the reason why I was interested in this topic, resolving conflict effectively, is in part at least because the work that I do with people, couples, families, individuals in therapy, I realize that the core skills, the essential skills that I'm going to be talking about today are essential, I would say, in a lot of different ways. People come in for a variety of presenting problems. It could be about increased need for conflict, for intimacy, talking about money, conflict around money, looking for deeper connection, more sexual intimacy. Lots of reasons, but the need to be able to have a good conflict together is an essential aspect of talking about any variety of topics. So I thought that that would be an interesting thing to talk about today. Also, there's just so much to talk about in terms of resolving conflict effectively. So what I planned is to go through some essential broad topics and things that I think would be valuable for the listeners to know and learn about, and that I'll present for 30 to 40 minutes, and that we'll have maybe 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A at the end, so that you listeners here will be able to help me dive further into any of the topics that I bring up today, or the concepts that I bring up through this Q&A. So then let's begin. So moving into the next slide here, we've got a set of assumptions. So Cassie, my navigation isn't working. There we go. Thank you for that. Okay, so moving into the second slide here, I wanted to just bring up some assumptions that I'm coming into this talk with. First of all, the conflict that you're experiencing, that I hope that you'll use these skills to resolve, is not physically dangerous or personally risky in any way. That kind of power dynamic where you have to pay attention and keep yourself safe really is a deal breaker for conflict resolution, and that's not a good use of these skills. I would say primarily make sure you're safe. Also, thinking about the work setting, obviously not physically risky in some way, hopefully, but the idea is that you are an employee and that you do need to keep your job safe. And so you might want to consider how is best you can keep the job, and you may not want to say exactly what you're thinking or feeling if your job is at risk. So taking that into consideration as you think about the skills I'm going to be talking about today. Also, another assumption, the parties involved will be having a good faith conflict. So we say what we mean and we don't lie in order to win. And so I'm looking to provide ways for you to have a win-win conflict. So win on both sides of the conversation, or all sides of the conversation, as opposed to a win-lose. And I think someone who's having a bad faith conversation is looking to win and looking to make the point or appear right or appear better in some way. So that is not going to be a good use of these skills. Okay, moving on to the next slide, assumptions continued. Another assumption here is that direct conversation about a disagreement is often difficult to do well, but it is important to have a genuine relationship. So if you want to have a genuine relationship, one must share their true feelings. And now, to be clear, I'm not saying 100% of the time. It's just that I want you to be able to consider these skills when it's appropriate, when it feels that you feel you need to talk about what's going on for you. Also, I want to be clear about, I'm using the word conflict, and I want to distinguish that from fight. It's really just two separate opinions, two differing views, and how do you come together and have a conversation about that, and that is not so easy. So I'll be thinking about people who tend to be conflict avoidant, but also maybe someone who has trouble approaching conflict, might be really willing to approach conflict, but doesn't quite do that as skillfully as they would like. So another assumption here is avoiding conflict can lead to increased resentment and frustration. So we tend to avoid conflict if we want to prioritize the relationship at hand. So that it could be a loved one, it could be a friend, it could be a coworker. If we're looking to have the relationship feel peaceful, you might avoid conflict. And if you do that over and over again and you never give yourself the opportunity to have a small conflict, then resentment can build up, and this can actually be bad for the relationship. So that's maybe counterintuitive, but important to keep in mind. So moving on to the next slide for goals for this talk, I'm hoping that listeners can leave here with improved communication skills and not necessarily to agree. So I mentioned the win-win. So if there's a win-win on both sides of a conversation, you may not agree, and that's okay. And so how do you do that, and how do you find a resolution there? That's an important skill to have. I also hope that you'll have an increased sense of confidence while in conflict, that you feel you are being the best person that you can be. You're presenting yourself in a conversation in the best form possible, and you're trying to do your best by the person you're speaking to. And if the conflict goes poorly because the other person doesn't have the skills, well, you tried your best, and you'll be able to keep these skills in mind and feel better about how you manage the conflict. Also, a goal is to improve relationships with loved ones, friends, and coworkers because of conflict, so with conflict. So I'm encouraging anyone who might feel like they'd rather not say the thing. It's easier in the short term not to say the hard thing, but this is sometimes counterintuitive, as I said earlier, that conflict can improve intimacy. So next, to do an overview of the presentation today, these are the core concepts as I thought of them that we'll be talking about today. So I'll be going into how to think about perspective and how to consider acceptance. What does acceptance mean? Also, how do emotions play into conflict? How do those play a role in how conflict tends to turn out? And how can you be more aware of that and be mindful, if not in control, of what goes on with your emotions and how you use them? Listening, speaking, those are key aspects to conflict, and also apologizing. So some of these things here on this slide, you may think, wow, this is so basic. I already know this. Obviously, I know how to listen, I know how to speak, I have the skills. I went to Northwestern, I'm a smart person. So let go of that. This is truly difficult stuff, especially when it's personal, especially when you feel invested in the outcome of the conversation. I will tell you, as a therapist, as a person, as my husband's partner, as a mother, as a friend, as a coworker, I am still working on all of these things that I'm going to be talking about with you today. It's hard. You're all, I think, a work in progress, and some circumstances are harder than others. So please come into this conversation or my presentation and our later conversation with an open mind of what you can learn here today. Okay, so the next slide, perspective. We're going to be talking about perspective first. So this idea that, I love this quote, songs are as sad as the listener. So that's by Jonathan Safran Foer, the author of Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. This idea that you could listen to any song, it could be a happy song, and it could be so incredibly sad considering your experience. I was just listening to some small story on NPR that people were calling in and talking about songs that have been ruined for them, and this woman said that she can't listen to this, whatever the great song by Queen was, because her partner broke up with her while listening to this great song, upbeat song, that is sad for her because she has that perspective of that song, and that's her truth. And so the facts of each person's experience are true. So this idea that this woman that I just spoke of might say, you know, we are the champions is so sad. And the next person might say, that's ridiculous, that's the happiest song, I feel so energized by that song. Both people are right. So this idea that the person you're speaking to in conflict has their own way of looking at things, and if you could respect that and appreciate that, this is a step closer to this win-win solution we're looking for. So some examples of how, another example here I added, one person might say, hey, I felt like you cared more about what you looked like to your friends than you cared about how I felt. That made me feel bad. Now that's a very skilled way to say this. It might not come out that way, but we'll talk about that later. So this is a scenario in which two people are walking, and one person, let's say it's two partners, one person saw some colleagues outside of work and got flustered and said hi to everybody but didn't introduce her partner. So then the person who saw her colleague says, I got caught up in the moment and I felt self-conscious about seeing my new colleagues out of work, so I forgot to introduce you. So both of those facts are true, and you can see maybe how that conversation would be really difficult to have, and how the person who forgot to introduce their partner might feel defensive and terrible, actually, for not introducing her partner. So, okay, so we'll talk more about that. Okay, let's move to the next slide. So that, what I just said was about perspective, and now we're moving into acceptance. So I've got this little person at the top here with a, you know, the little, I'm blanking on the word, magnifying glass. And really what this person is doing is just trying to see what is there. You're not trying to approve of it. You're not trying to grow it. You're not trying to make more of the thing you're working to accept. You're just trying to see it. So you're trying to accept what the other is saying and feeling, and it's not to agree and it is not to approve. So you're just trying to see what is. And to add, bringing in this idea of perspective, what the person is feeling is true. That's there in that moment. And if you can work to accept that and hear that, that will be a step in the right direction for conflict resolution. So acceptance is not to accept what, to not accept what the other person is saying creates discord and misunderstanding. So this happens all the time. So why is this difficult to do? Why is acceptance difficult to do? It's because I'm including myself in this because this is so hard. Often you find yourself stuck in a conflict because you're focused on the goal of fixing the other person's views so that they won't be hurt in the first place. And so the goal of fixing the other person's views so that they won't be hurt is not going to work, because the fact is they feel what they feel. It's already done. It already happened. They feel offended. The partner feels hurt because she wasn't introduced. And there's a lot of meaning under that for that person. And so if her partner said, oh, you know, don't worry about that. This is what I meant. Here's why I did that. Don't feel that in the first place. That creates discord and misunderstanding, and then that is the beginning of maybe a fight as opposed to a good conflict. And so acceptance increases understanding and decreases conflict. And so we'll talk a little bit, a lot of the things I'm talking about today are building on each other. So there's ways that later we're going to talk about listening skills and speaking skills, and these ideas of perspective and acceptance will build into that, and how that's so hard to do, and how you can say something that implies acceptance as you're trying to listen. Also, just so that you know, this will come together also in an example in the end, so I'm going to try to put some meat on these concepts so you can kind of understand what that would look like or how that sounds in practice. Okay, so we're moving to the next slide. I would say that emotions in conflict is so content heavy. There's so much to say here about emotions and conflict. You know, you could invite me back to another webinar, and I could give the whole hour-long webinar on emotions and conflict. So I'm presenting here today some core details and some core skills that I'm hoping can be meaningful here, and I'll try to make this digestible. So this idea that when we feel threatened, when we feel accused of something, when we feel misunderstood, when we think that we're being attacked, or even if you see a loved one feeling hurt, we can feel flooded by emotions. And when we're flooded by emotions, we go into the flight, fight, or freeze response. I expect probably many listeners have heard of this before. So the idea that if there's a threat, there's a response. There's adrenaline that runs through your body, and your body is telling you, I need to fix this. I need to run from the threat. I need to fight the threat, or I don't know what to do, so I'm going to freeze. And so in conflict, sometimes the freeze looks like shutting down or stonewalling. And so these emotions are truly powerful, and if you don't have your eye on them, they can make you do things and say things that you don't mean or you regret later. So this little graph here with the concentric circles was adapted from dialectical and behavior therapy. So there's a specific workbook which is listed here at the bottom of the slide, DBT Skills Training Handouts and Worksheets by Marshall Linehan. So this concept that we have these different states of mind. Reasonable mind, is ruled by facts, ruled by reason. Reasonable mind is cool, calm, and collected, and it only looks at what makes sense. And it doesn't really consider how one might feel in the moment. It might not consider, you might have great plans to do something, but in the moment, because of the emotions involved, it doesn't go that way. And you didn't consider that maybe because you were in reasonable mind. Emotional mind, on the other side, is mood dependent. It's emotion focused. This could mean joy. This could mean anger. This could mean sadness, guilt, shame, disgust. You know, all of the emotions that we might have. And this isn't, neither of these things on their own is a bad thing. We need them both. We need emotions to fuel our opinions of things, to tell us how we want things to go. Emotions are helpful to us. But sometimes they can be out of control, and we don't even realize that we're acting on something before it's over. And then you realize, I shouldn't have done that. I didn't think that through very much. So this idea of combining the two things, thinking about your emotions, is wise mind, or what Marshall Linehan would call wise mind. So this is about seeing both the logic and the emotion. And so this is where, you know, in DBT, there's a whole, you know, class on how to adopt wise mind, how to create that experience, and it takes a lot of practice. And so what I'll say is that it takes being aware of what you're feeling in the moment and thinking about, what do I feel like doing right now? Like, what's my urge in this moment? And then what am I going to feel like I wish I did tomorrow? So tomorrow, this might not feel as intense. So if any of the listeners have had an experience where they feel so hurt, you know, they think, okay, you're dead to me, I'm never talking to you again, and you hang up the phone on the person because you're so upset. And then maybe a day passes, or maybe an hour passes, and you think, oh, okay, well, it's not as big of a deal. I don't mean that. That's not actually happening. So that kind of thing fuels emotion mind. And so you think to yourself, I feel like I'm stuck in traffic. I feel like screaming. I feel like speeding because I'm stressed out that I want to get to work, and I'm so angry with myself for being late. But, you know, I know that's going to give me a ticket, and possibly, or potentially a car accident. And so I'm going to go the speed limit, even though every fiber of my being right now is telling me to speed. So that's what wise mind is about. It doesn't feel calm, but it does keep those emotions controlled. Okay, so that's a crash course in wise mind. Moving on to the next slide, again about emotions and conflict. This actually is a little bit, I've already talked about this. I described how the threat that's perceived, so that's that top line, is the adrenaline pumping through your system. So the time is from the left to the right. It goes from earlier in this moment to later in the moment. And the top line is what you feel in your body. When you feel anger, it's called anger mountain in this example, but I would say this also applies to other emotions as well. So you're climbing anger mountain because you're feeling that threat, that fight, flight, freeze reaction. And then what happens when we're in that state of mind is that we lose our ability to think clearly. And so that's the bottom line. So as the adrenaline pumps in your system, as you become reactive to something, like I said earlier, maybe somebody is hurt by you, offended, they're addressing something with you, asking you to understand something, or maybe you're being accused of something, or somebody's being a jerk on the road and they cut you off. So you perceive some kind of threat and you get upset by this, then your ability to think clearly drops. You become stupider. You stop using the rational part of your brain. And so that's clearly not the time to have a thoughtful conversation, not the time to have a deep conversation about your conflict. So keeping this in mind, the idea is wait, have a break. You're not going to be able to listen in this state of mind. Take some deep breaths, go away, maybe go away for an hour. It depends on the person. The way that your adrenaline drops in your system depends on your own personal physiology, so you know yourself best. Some people are ready in 20 minutes to come back to the conversation. Other people need a lot longer, and so just use your best judgment. Okay, so keeping that in mind. Next slide is about listening skills. So this is a word-heavy quote, so many of you are probably already trying to read it. I'm going to read it and let the words wash over you. Don't require yourself to understand everything. I'm going to summarize it in just a second. So this person, M. Scott Peck, is a psychiatrist. He's the author of The Road Less Traveled. And he claims that an essential part of true listening is the discipline of bracketing, the temporary giving up or setting aside of one's own prejudices, frames of reference, and desires, so as to experience, as far as possible, the speaker's world from the inside. Step inside his or her shoes. So this idea that to be a good listener, you have to put yourself aside. You have to put aside your opinions, your expectations of what the person means before they say it. So this idea that you want to just be present to what's being said. And that's difficult. That's incredibly difficult because it can be personal, even if this is about work, even if this is about a friend, they're telling you something about you. I would say it's probably easier to listen if it's not personal. If a person is calling you, telling you about somebody else that they're upset about or that they feel hurt by, you can say, oh, that was terrible, what a jerk, that's terrible that they said that, and you can empathize maybe with the person, or, oh, maybe you could think about it this way. But if the person is looking to have a conflict with you and say, here's what you did, and here's why it hurt my feelings, or here's what you did, and I'm disappointed that happened, or this isn't the project that you were assigned, and so you did it incorrectly, here's some feedback. That is where the emotions start to come in because it's personal. You want to be seen as well-intended. You want to be seen as a good and thoughtful person, and you don't want to hurt somebody. So we get fixated on trying to fix the way that you're being perceived before you listen. And so when we react like that, that's what stops understanding, and that's what stops the person from feeling heard when they bring something to you. So keeping in mind this idea of putting yourself aside and how to do that. So some of the next slide here, reflective listening is a way to practice putting yourself aside. I would say that putting yourself aside in order to listen requires some internal mindfulness, to be aware. What do I want to say? What do I feel like saying? So there's a lot of work there internally, but what I'm describing here in terms of reflexive listening is what you could say and how the skills to use that you can practice and what you could say to the person instead of your opinion or your assumption about what's being said. So reflective listening is a form of listening. It's about what you would say to the person as to give them the experience that you've heard them. So this requires understanding the entire message being delivered. So that's literally what the person said, but it's also maybe there's emotions that aren't said. Maybe there's tears in the person's eyes, and you might wonder, are they upset? Are they sad? Are they hurt? Even though they haven't said those words. So you're reading nonverbals and verbal communication. The idea, this is back to putting yourself aside, don't yet offer opinions, reactions, or solutions. This is easy to do because our logical thinking mind is, if you fix the way that they're thinking, then they're going to feel better. So let me give you a solution, let me fix this, and then you're going to not be upset. Also verbalize what you're hearing back to the person. So repeat back, what are you hearing them say? And this is very hard. I'll say this is part of what I do in my job. And I would say the attempt to try to repeat back what the person said is wonderful. That's a wonderful experience. Even if you got it wrong, the person notices that you're really trying to understand what's being said. So I don't know if listeners remember the movie Dumb and Dumber from the early 90s. There's a really funny scene where Jim Carrey is talking to this woman he's absolutely infatuated by, he loves her, and he asks her, I don't remember exactly the words, but he's basically saying, I'd love to be with you, I want to date you, and she has to decline him because she doesn't like him, she's not interested. And so she says something like, you know, your chances of us getting into a relationship are maybe 1 in a million, basically saying not a chance. So he responds to her and he says, so you're saying there's a chance? That's maybe literally what she said. There's actually a chance of 1 in a million. And if you're playing the lottery, maybe that's a good chance. But that's not what she was saying. And so here's a work example for reflective listening. And again, I'm going to go back into more examples later. And I'm looking at the time. So maybe I have about 10 more minutes to get through this, maybe 11 minutes. Okay, so a work example would be a person sends out an email. There's a team of people and they agreed, or at least one person in that team thought that they agreed that they would wait on this email, and another person in the team just sent out the email instead. And so one person says to the other, I'm surprised that you sent out the email. I thought we were going to wait on that. And reflective listening would be, so you understood the instructions differently than I did, it sounds like. You thought we were going to wait. So that's, you can see there's a little interpretation of what's being said there. Maybe the person could have said, oh, you were surprised. Okay, so you weren't expecting that. So that's reflective listening. Reflective listening is not saying something like, so you think I'm stupid and you don't think I have a reason to have sent out the email? You don't think I might have talked to our boss about that? So that's interpreting what the person is saying. That's not what they literally said, and that's not a good start to a conflict. Okay, moving to the next slide. Speaking skills, this is just kind of some things that we've already talked about, but also some things we're going to get into in a minute. So keeping it short. So when you're speaking to someone, you're trying to deliver the message, you want to keep it bite-sized, because if you're going into a whole paragraph, if this is in person, I would say conflict is often best had in person as opposed to over text or email. That's maybe something we can get into if people are interested in that in the Q&A. But in person, keeping it short so that the person can actually hear what's being said. So I would say 2 to 3 sentences to start out, as opposed to a whole, monologue about what was said. Slowing down. I would say working to reflectively listen back to the person slows things down. That's the act of slowing things down. But you want to make sure that there's understanding before you move on to the next point. Checking your emotions, just again, keeping in mind that anger mountain image, wise mind, those things, making sure you check in with yourself. How am I feeling about this? What's my reactions right now? I'm going to mention in the next slide, speaking from your own experience as opposed to mind reading. And be willing to apologize. We'll talk about that later too. Okay, so speaking from your own experience, only from there. So doing that lowers the chances that the other person will feel defensiveness, because you're speaking, this is back to perspective, you're speaking about your perspective, and there's language to use that indicates that you are speaking from your truth. This is the only truth you know, and you can't mind read. You don't know what, this is back to the example I said earlier. So I see, you think I'm stupid and I didn't consult the boss. Nope, that's not what the person said. So you speak from your experience. Describe observable behaviors, don't interpret. So the person, never mind, I'm not going to go into the example. I think that's pretty clear. Okay, next slide, speaking only from your experience. So there's this idea of a you message, Y-O-U message, versus an I message, the letter I message. So these are examples of this. So stop attacking me, you're being so rude. So that's a you message. You're saying what the other person is doing, you're judging, versus when you raise your voice, so that's a literal description of a fact that at least as far as you could tell, the person's voice was raised, the volume was raised. I say that, when your voice is raised and say that I never help you with anything, I feel defensive and hopeless. So the person in this example raised their voice and said, you never help me with anything. That was ideally in this example, literally what was said. Then the person is explaining, when you say that to me, I feel defensive. So there's the I, my experiences, that I'm not sure what to do with that. I'm feeling defensive and I'm feeling hopeless. So there's a door into that, whereas if you say, stop attacking me, you're being so rude, that's a door in the face. You're closing the door to the conversation, because likely the other person is going to say, I'm not attacking you, I'm just want some help. And so that will go downhill from there. So keeping in mind your experience and using an I message when you can. And next slide, apologizing. So there is research, actually. I was interested to see, as I was researching this presentation, that a well-timed apology is meaningful. And the research shown is that a later apology is better. So if you wait in the conversation, you wait to hear what the person is saying, what they're feeling, and then after maybe you've done some reflective listening, apologizing after all that tends to go better than if you're noticing the person's pain and you want to apologize for that immediately. Because if you are apologizing earlier, likely you're not going to know exactly what's meaningful to the other person. Why are you apologizing? So make sure you know what is meaningful to the other person, because this is about their perspective of it. If you were talking to a different person, you might have to apologize for something else. So being willing to apologize, that can go a long way. It's also okay to ask the person what is meaningful. The goal of an apology is to communicate that you understand the damage done and that the person is reasonable for being hurt. This is a true gift. If you're able to say, it makes sense that you're hurt, or it makes sense that you're upset, even though you didn't intend for the person to be hurt or be upset, this is like popping the tension in a conversation immediately, and it's a true gift to be able to say that to somebody. So keep that in mind. This also, doing that takes putting yourself aside, back to that quote. Okay, next slide about apologizing. I have some common apology fails that I've seen. So there's the recap, which is, I said I was sorry, what more do you want from me? And often the person who says, I said I was sorry, I didn't witness an apology when I've heard that. So this is maybe an attempt to apologize, but it's like, okay, I already did that. I said I was sorry, get over it. That's basically what that message is saying. And so that's not an apology. There's the insult. I'm sorry that you're having a difficult time understanding me. So that's kind of saying you're slow, you're not getting it, and I regret that you aren't getting it. So that's a hidden insult. That's not an apology. There's also the complaint. I'm sorry, what else do you want? It's like, geez, I'm sorry already. Why are you taking me through this? I can't take it anymore. I can't take your complaints. What else do you want from me? So that's also not an apology. So the authors of the last lecture say that a good apology is like an antibiotic, and a bad apology is like rubbing salt in the wound. So if you use an apology, this is a good route toward conflict resolution. It can go a very, very long way. Okay, next slide, bringing it all together with an example. So the below details, I just made this all up based on things that I've seen through the years in therapy, in my personal life, things that I've observed people dealing with and the ways people tend to react. Okay, so this is an opposite sex couple in this example, married couple. Wife Donna is 42 and her husband Reggie is 45. Both work full time and they have an 8-year-old son together. On Wednesday night, the couple talked together about plans for that coming Friday. Donna agreed that she'd make dinner for her and Reggie after their son goes to bed. So this required a lot of planning. She had to actually leave work a little bit early, get the groceries a couple days before, and plan for their dinner together and maybe hopefully a movie. On Friday, Reggie calls Donna a few hours before he was supposed to be home. Change of plans. Unfortunately, he was called into a project at work. This was out of his hands. He's going to actually have to work the whole weekend. And he also has to stay late on Friday. So you can imagine how disappointing this is. So let's talk about, next slide, perspective. So remember these are the concepts that we went through. We've got the I there from the previous slide as well. Perspective. So Donna might say, I am so frustrated and disappointed because I was looking forward to this. When your work takes priority over our plans, I feel rejected and disrespected. Now these examples are incredibly skilled. Let's not expect you to be so perfect ever. Likely you're going to say, what? I can't believe that happened. You might express some frustration, so you try to aim towards this. This is what you can keep in mind, like, okay, how can I use an iMessage? How can I describe how I'm feeling as clearly as possible without attacking? Reggie also might say, I'm frustrated too because this was out of my control. When you say you feel disrespected, it makes me think you think I did this because I don't care. And so that's also incredibly skilled. If Reggie heard, I'm frustrated and disappointed, and Reggie's already feeling frustrated and disappointed by needing to work late, likely he's already primed for defensiveness. And so this is where keeping in mind, okay, this is a tough conversation. My emotions are running high because I'm frustrated. And so trying to see that going into the conversation is going to set you up well. So Donna could have said, wow, I'm never a priority to you. I can see that now. And Reggie could have said, you know what, you don't respect how much I work. I work all the time, I'm breaking my back, and you don't care about that. All you care about is your dinner. And so obviously that would be incredibly offensive. Okay, so moving to the next concept here in this example, acceptance. So Donna's challenge is to feel her hurt and anger while also accepting that Reggie is saying he couldn't help this. So she has to believe that that's true, and she also has to deal with feeling what she's feeling. Reggie's challenge is to feel frustrated by the late night at work while also accepting that Donna is upset and hurt. And so that's back to if Reggie tried to fix her upset and hurt and say, you know what, don't be upset, don't be hurt, because, we've got maybe Sunday night we can do this. I didn't do this on purpose. It's my boss. I couldn't have told you earlier. Those are all things that likely Donna will want to hear eventually. But if he can accept her feelings first without feeling defensive about that, and then get to the explanation later, that's going to help. And it's going to feel healing, and it will increase their intimacy. Okay, next slide about emotions. It's probably already clear. All the emotions that might be going on for both of these people. But Donna's possible anger mountain vulnerabilities, the things that might make her adrenaline start pumping, are anger, frustration, sadness, hurt, rejection, loneliness, resentment, especially if this has happened before. Reggie's possible anger mountain vulnerabilities, anger, frustration, sadness, lots of the same feelings: defensiveness, helplessness, loneliness, resentment, especially if they're trying to connect. They're trying to have this dinner because they've been meaning to reconnect. Okay, listening. Next slide. Almost done here, 2 more slides. Listening, so Donna, this is a really skilled way to do this. So if Donna were to reflectively listen to what Reggie said, she would be saying, I hear that this is frustrating for you. It's as frustrating to you as it is for me, and that you had no control over the assignment you received. I get that you're disappointed to miss these plans too. And so what the person who's reflectively listening is looking for is for the other person to say, yes, you got it, exactly, yes, that's what I'm saying. So that's the goal. Reggie could say, I understand how you would feel disrespected by this. So this is tough. This is very personal because Reggie is not saying, I understand because I was disrespectful. Reggie's not admitting to being disrespectful. He's just saying, I understand how you would feel disrespected by this since you spent so much time planning for this night. I also get that this makes you feel unimportant or like a lower priority. You're not crazy for thinking that or feeling that. Maybe Reggie could say, if I were in your shoes, I might feel that too. And probably soon after that, Reggie would say, that's not the case. That's not how I feel. But saying those words and acknowledging how the other person feels, again, it takes the air out of the conflict. And then apologizing. To the next slide. So this all depends on what was said and how Donna felt and how Reggie felt. But Donna could possibly apologize this way. I'm sorry that I was having a hard time believing that this was out of your hands. Or, I'm sorry that you have to deal with this work stress and that you have to work late again. That's really hard. That's a lot, and that we have to miss this together. And Reggie could say, I'm sorry that you put all this effort into planning for tonight only to find out that we had to cancel our plans and that was pretty last minute. Or, I'm sorry that we won't be getting the chance to connect the way we wanted to, at least tonight, but I'm hoping that we can do it later. So that's how all of these skills might come together in a very skilled conversation. And that is the end of my presentation, so I made it in 43 minutes. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing any questions that you might have. I don't have my eye on the comments that have been coming in, so Cassie's going to monitor that for me. And Cassie's going to come in and let me know what you've been thinking about, what are your reactions, what are your questions and opinions.
Yeah, that was so great, Jane. Thank you so much for all of this really great information and tips and tricks. And we do have some really interesting questions and situations that have come up through the chat tab as well as the Q&A tab. So we'll get into those, and of course I'll encourage folks to continue to send those questions in through the Q&A tab. And you can upvote questions if you have a similar thought. So we'll start with Paul's question. He said, can you please discuss resolving conflict when the other does not fight fairly? Also, today's conflictual politics would seem to be ripe for a field for these tools. How can we get people without wise minds to begin to acquire them or to fight fairly, if you will?
Really good question. There's a couple different questions there. So one is about what do you do if the person you're speaking to isn't fighting fairly? And then also, how do you get a person to acquire wise mind? And I'll start with the second one first. I would say that you can't expect yourself to have another person adopt wise mind. There's nothing we can really do about the other person's decision to be in an emotional state of mind. All you can do is speak from your perspective and maybe describe what's going on. So if a person is not in wise mind and is not able to be thoughtful and listen, they're not being skilled. I guess all you could say is, what's offensive about that? And again, trying to stick to the facts. And, so when you call me, some crazy conservative or crazy liberal, that makes me feel shut down. It makes me feel like you don't want to listen to what I have to say. So that's maybe a description that person could respond to. But you can't force them to change what they're doing. And ultimately, if you experience a person to be on top of this anger mountain, that's not a good conversation to have. And you might want to just exit that conversation. You can be a model for how you expect to be treated. And so if you experience somebody being emotional or not fighting fairly, you would be, or I would, let's say, might be defensive and want to then meet them where they're at and not fight fairly either and give them what they're giving to me. But if you can hold on to what kind of person do you want to be in this conflict, then the person could take that as an example. Hopefully, that would be great. Maybe they don't, but maybe later they go home and they think about it and they consider how they might change next time, and they would admire your skills. Now, the other question was, how do you respond when a person is not fighting fairly? I would say maybe what I said already applies to that you're trying to describe. What is it that you notice about how they're not fighting fairly? Sometimes we don't even know if a person isn't fighting fairly. So if a person's lying and making up things, you don't necessarily know that. So you have to just try your best and be honest and straightforward yourself and try to find the truth as much as you can get to it. But what are you observing? This is highly dependent on the circumstances. I'm trying to make up examples in my head, but maybe a person is appearing defensive. Maybe they're contradicting themselves. Maybe they're, making you feel defensive, or I don't know if we could say they're making you feel defensive, but we could say you're feeling defensive. So you're trying just to describe the facts, and if you're doubting that they're being straightforward with you, I'm not sure if it would be helpful to say that or not, but keeping that in mind and maybe saying to the person, listen, I want to be honest with you. I want to have a good faith conversation, just stating your intentions. So anyway, that's what I'll say about that. Just keeping in mind that you only have control over yourself and that you can influence a person with your words, but it's their choice to be influenced or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And Jane, another common theme that's come up is kind of patterns of hurt. And so one question that came through around this topic was, how do you keep a dialogue open if one person feels like they've been wronged too much over extended periods of time and they are now closed off to further discussion and understanding because they've been so hurt?
Yeah, that's a good question. That happens a lot. And so I would ask, or I would wonder, what has happened before that moment that the person has decided that they've been hurt too much? Has this person who's been hurt attempted to address the problem before that? And often people have. And, I see so many times in couples therapy, people sitting in front of me and one person saying, there's been years that this problem has been going on, and I've been trying to tell it to you in different ways, and that the person sitting next to them said, I didn't hear that. I didn't know that until now. And so sometimes you may believe that you have communicated as best you could, and the person may not have heard it. They may not have been in the frame of mind, or maybe the words being used to describe the hurt were not clear. Were you using you messages? So thinking about the skills that I talked about today, was the person who's hurt using that? So all of that. I would also say that there are times when a person could be hurt, and if it happens too many times, maybe that's an answer. Maybe there's an answer there in the person's actions, and that is it possible that they don't have the intentions of not hurting you? So that's also to be considered. I'm not suggesting here that you need to remain in dialogue if there's a chronic problem that the person doesn't seem willing to address. So I would just advise that the person make sure that they're assessing their attempts to address the problem, making sure that they're being clear about their hurt. And if the person who's been hurt feels that they've done the best job that they possibly can at communicating that hurt and describing in a non-defensive way what could be done to ameliorate the problem, then maybe that's the answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's really helpful, Jane, and great advice. And we have some other questions coming in around the timing of initiating some of these conflicts. Nedra is asking, can you talk about timeliness of initiating conflict? It does not always make sense to raise your concerns in the moment, for example, in a team meeting or event. But you would like to follow up after? What is the process like, particularly if a person doesn't always remember their actions.
Oh, that's tough. That's really a hard one. When they don't remember, that's challenging. So there's a lot about timing there. There's a lot of thoughts that came up as I was listening to the question. I would say that sometimes bringing something up in the moment is very effective, because then you can describe literally what's just happened and what you feel about it. Often that's not possible. I would say even some people's brains work differently. Personally, it's harder for me to bring something up in the moment because I have to walk away, think about it, and realize why I felt uncomfortable, why that was difficult for me. And then I come up with the words later. Other people can, in the moment, say, hey, I didn't like that, and oh, what was that about, or why did you say that? That made me uncomfortable, or that confused me. And so timing about coming back later, I would say that's a good thing to sit and think, like, what is it that I observed that caused a problem for me? And looking at trying to challenge yourself to describe facts. And if you notice yourself interpreting, maybe even owning that, say, oh, here's how I'm interpreting the facts. I'm not sure how you feel about that. So keeping in mind leaving a window open to their perspective. And I would say the timing in general would be closest to the problem as possible. So the longer you wait, the more things that happen that might change the problem in the first place. And like we said, the person might not remember what happened. They might not remember the exchange if you wait even a week. So it can be personally challenging to force yourself to bring something up, but it would increase your success if you could bring it up as quickly as possible after giving it as much thought as you possibly can. So it's that balance. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, definitely. Some really good things to consider. And Suzanne is asking a question around the apology piece. And she is wondering, with an apology, or a good apology, if you will, can it be implied that you actually do not agree with the other person's views?
Yeah, could you say that again? I just want to make sure I hear.
With an apology, can it be implied that you do not agree with the other person's view?
Yeah, so I'm hearing the question to be, is it okay in an apology to communicate that you don't agree? I think,
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think, I'm trying to think of an example of that. I do think that's appropriate because maybe my example, I think with Donna and Reggie is a good example of that. Reggie needing to say, I understand how you would feel disrespected. So Reggie doesn't agree with that. He was not being disrespectful. He wasn't being inconsiderate. He let her know as soon as possible. It was out of his hands, all those things. And so, it can be helpful, I think, for the person to know that I understand that you feel that and that that's not true, but I would say leave some space for those two facts to be slightly separate from each other, because as quick as you try to say that's not true, you might trample the apology. And so trying to keep the apology and saying, I recognize that this is your experience, period, at the end of the sentence. And also, that's not how I see it. So those two things are true, but leaving them into separate sentences and maybe even pausing for a second.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and a great point. And Jane, I know we're approaching the hour, but I want to take maybe one more question before we get into closing notes, if that's perfect. Margarita is writing in, how can you manage a situation when what hurts you is a blind spot for the other person, and when you've brought it up before, but they've become defensive because in their eyes, what's wrong is really you?
Yeah, that's so hard. I think this depends on who it is we're talking about. So if we're talking about a friend or a loved one, and the person trying to bring up the blind spot is seeking connection and wanting to maintain a genuine a genuine relationship with this person, perhaps it would be helpful in as caring and delicate a way as possible to say, I wonder if what I'm saying is a blind spot for you. It hurts me when you blame me for this because that's not how I see it. Can you please hear me out? Hear me out, because this is a pattern for me. And what I say to people in therapy, families, couples, even the individuals that I work with, that if a loved one is bringing up a problem and that they're unhappy, then there's a problem, and that needs to be addressed. Even if the other person says, well, that's not my problem, that's not my concern, I didn't do it, so I guess you're going to have to deal with that. No, you actually do, because the other person is feeling hurt. So we've got to figure out what to do about that. Now, if this is a colleague or coworker, that's maybe a little bit more challenging, because maybe there's more formal ways to get that information across, and maybe there's people you could pull in to give you advice about how to manage the hurt. So I'm not sure if that's a work situation, but maybe there's a supervisor, somebody you could pull in to ask advice on how to deal with that. But I challenge the person to even name. Often what I say here is that people will say, here's the problem that I'm dealing with, here's how it feels to me. And if they could say exactly what they just said to me to the person, that could be pretty effective. So maybe think about saying what you just said in this question.
Yeah, Jane, this is so helpful, and all of this has been such great advice, and I know people are really enjoying your words of wisdom, and I'd love to give you a minute or so if you have anything else you'd like to share before we end for the day.
Yeah, well, I guess my first thought is this was my first webinar. I've given presentations before, but this was my first webinar, and I enjoy it, and looking forward to debriefing with Cassie and hearing more about what people's reactions were. But I really appreciate everybody who dialed in and listened live, and who may be listening to this at a later time. And I hope that what I had to say today was helpful.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jane, again, for all of this great information. And we appreciate everybody for tuning into the call as well. And we will be sending out a link to the recording later today, but you can find all of our archived and upcoming webinars at our website at alumni.northwestern.edu/career webinars. We hope you have a great rest of your day, and go Cats!